Welcome into another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I am your host, Graham Hall, joined once again by my co-host, Jacob Rudner. And we have 13 Florida fall camp practices now in the books. The Gators have scrimmaged once. We'll scrimmage again. We're recording this Friday afternoon. They'll scrimmage again in about 24 hours in Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. Unfortunately, the news that we have to talk about coming out of that first fall camp scrimmage was not super promising, as for the second straight year, the Gators have suffered a season-ending injury in their first practice of fall camp. This was to Jamari Lyons. As everyone remembers, last year, Justice Boone went down with a torn ACL on a non-contact play, just a kind of a fluke incident there that left him out for the entire year, was still working his way back in spring. And now it appears as if Jamari Lyons will be facing an extensive rehabilitation process of his own after he suffered a broken ankle in that scrimmage. You know, this is a guy who, heading into his third year at Florida, expectations I think were high for him after he really was able to see the field last year, flash some things, and was going to provide some depth there at that nose tackle spot. But as Billy Napier noted, this is a guy who had some position flexibility, the ability to play on the end as well. Really don't have a guy with his combination of experience being where they are in their career and the ability to play at nose and on the end. And it's going to be kind of, I think, a collective effort to fill that void for him. What do you make of the injury to Lyons, Jacob, and who are some names that Florida fans should be monitoring for someone who could see extended snaps to fill the void there after he went down?
Yeah, well, if you're following the program closely, I think it was pretty clear at this point that Jamari Lyons was somebody who was looked at as a leader, somebody who was looked at as kind of that emotional backbone of this defensive line room. But, and this isn't a knock on him because Florida is better equipped in the depth department along its defensive front, I don't think he was a projected starter. And that's significant for Florida because at the end of the day, it does not lose a first-team defender. It loses somebody in Lyons who was looked at as more of a rotational piece. But that isn't to lessen the impact. That is simply to say that I think Florida avoided a worst-case scenario with his injury, but certainly a tough one nonetheless. This is a guy, like I said, who has the respect of his teammates. He's somebody who I think was looked at to be kind of an enforcer of the rules, to be somebody who could hold guys accountable. Caleb Banks told what I thought was a touching story about how there was a practice where Banks wasn't necessarily performing up to the standard, and Lyons was quick to call him out, and he knew immediately this isn't done because Jamari Lyons has something against me or Jamari Lyons wanted to yell at me. It was done because Jamari Lyons cares about me, and it seems to be the sentiment that we've heard from a lot of his teammates, many of whom we were told were crying, some hysterically after the injury occurred. So Jamari Lyons, of course, meant a whole lot to this Florida team, if for no other reason than his emotional investment in the group. And as far as replacing him goes, I don't necessarily think it will be the most straightforward process. Like I said, he is a reserve player in this defense, one of their top rotational players along its defensive front. I'll look at guys like Kelby Collins, Tyreek Sapp, even the freshman Mekhi Barrow and DeAndre Robinson are guys who I think will be capable of getting some reps inside. Billy Napier has mentioned that Jamari Lyons was not just a nose tackle for this team. He did get some reps at end, so guys like Caleb Banks will also be a factor in trying to replace him. But one thing is certain at this point, Graham, I think we know that it will be a team effort to replace Lyons. It will not just be one guy. It's not that easy or straightforward. And in terms of replacing his leadership, I think Florida's hopeful that, like with Justice Boone last year, it will have Jamari Lyons around the team. I've heard from multiple people that the expectation is that once he's physically able to do so, he will travel with the group, again, in that same way that Boone did, so he can continue to provide that leadership and his emotional presence.
Yeah, it's certainly a blow to Florida for what had been a relatively injury-free camp. Last week's episode, we talked about the injury to Montrell Johnson, but that was one where he still has the potential of playing in that first game of the season on August 31st against Miami, depending how these next, 2 weeks go for the Gators. I think that you look at some of the other injuries that they've been dealing with, Cam Waits missing a little bit of time recently, Cormani McLean. These are all, reserve pieces for the Gators, as important as having depth is on your roster. And certainly with a guy like Waits, who was pushing for a role there on the right side of the offensive line, potentially as you've written at Swamp247. For anyone listening to this, encourage you to go read Jacob's inside info on the battle along the offensive line. Really good stuff out there for VIP subscribers over at Swamp247. But other than the injury to Johnson and before this injury to Lyons, the Gators have been praising the ability to benefit from the strength and conditioning program and be able to avoid injury at a higher rate. But it is something that is going to happen. It's always devastating when you see one of your teammates go from tirelessly working throughout the spring and into the summer and thinking they're going to play a role, and then in the blink of an eye, their priorities shift from having to, vie for this on-field role to being in the training room and undergoing surgery and having to shift their focus to rehabbing. It certainly can be difficult for players from a mental perspective. And that is a lot of what we heard. You mentioned Caleb Banks talking about how heavy it was when he went down. He visited him in the hospital, and Lyons made it clear that, I want you guys to keep going and keep striving for me, because I know you would want the same thing for me to do if this was you in the situation. Joey Slackman, a guy who's only been in Gainesville for 8 months. I think this speaks to the impact that Lyons has made. Joey Slackman said this is the guy who's the heartbeat of our room, an emotional leader. And often you think that roles like that are reserved for guys who are going to be standout first team contributors, but that's certainly not always the case. And it's not the case here with Lyons. And, I did think that one of the most notable things that, came out of a player in the aftermath was Shamar James, who was right there and is working his way back from a season-ending injury of his own. He hasn't been in a game in 10 months for the Gators now after suffering that dislocated kneecap last year. He was right there when Lyons went down. And he said it kind of felt like I got hurt again. That was a guy who hadn't really undergone surgery before, had his first significant injury, and a fellow third-year guy who understands how difficult that can be at this point in a player's career to have to shift their focus from becoming a potential breakout contributor on the defensive line to now being a guy who has to spend their time in the training room and recovery. So certainly a blow to Florida and Florida's locker room. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is something that I think kind of is an inspirational type thing for Florida. Not that they were needing any type of inspiration, considering how the deck is stacked against them and everyone's already written them off. But when you see a teammate go down, it can kind of, I think, drive home the message of taking advantage of the opportunity, because you can lose it in the blink of an eye. We are going to talk a little bit more about some of the other ailments that Florida is dealing with right now. I mentioned weights, and I mentioned losing Cormani McLean, who is now back at practice, but a couple other guys recently who are largely depth pieces at two positions that I do think are kind of under the microscope. That's Bryce Lovett on the offensive line, who's been in a non-contact jersey recently, and Bryce Thornton, a guy who they added experience at safety, but you do think that he was going to be a guy who was going to contribute in some capacity, albeit a limited one, but would serve a role on special teams. Those are two other injuries of note here. I want to talk a little bit more about the offensive line. Just with Waits being out right now, it kind of has driven home in my mind that Florida has got to settle on their options there on the right side of the line. If there was any doubt whatsoever whether it was going to be George and Brandon Crenshaw-Dickson, I think that with Waits out and still potentially out for the foreseeable future, who knows if he's going to be able to return in time for the scrimmage tomorrow. I think that this kind of means that you have to go for those two guys that you've worked at the right side of the line for the last 7 months in George and Crenshaw-Dickson. Do you agree with that perspective? And what more have you seen and heard recently from Florida's offensive line?
Well, I'll start by saying this. Waits is back. He has practiced Friday. He was out on the field and working out with his unit. We're still not entirely sure what exactly is the cause of his recent lack of full availability for practices. The good news for Florida is that he has been on the practice field even while this has been going on, even if that's been in a limited capacity. So he is back. I think that we were trending towards a reality in which Damian George and Brandon Crenshaw-Dickson were going to start at right guard and right tackle, respectively. I think that, Cam Waits has been in this cross-training mode for some time now, where he's gotten some first-team snaps at right guard and right tackle. I think at one point that seemed like Florida's method of creating some competition where he would be able to maybe replace either George or Crenshaw-Dickson in the starting lineup at one of those two positions. But with his availability recently, I would say that the trend is more so that Florida is preparing him to be their sixth offensive lineman, somebody who can slot in at either guard or tackle when he's healthy and if needed. And they're preparing, again, like I said, to be able to start the other two guys who were, one of whom is a veteran transfer, the other is in his second year in the system. You mentioned Bryce Lovett. We also aren't entirely sure what the ailment is, other than the fact that he is still in a non-contact jersey. This, when I say still, I mean on Friday, August 16th. We're recording this at 3 p.m. Florida practiced this morning at around 10:30 in the morning. So as of the day of us recording this, he is still in non-contact. They did get Caden Jones and Fletcher Westphal back, but I don't think either of those guys are really going to be a factor. I think Lovett probably has the best chance to factor into Florida's too deep, especially as an interior offensive lineman. I think the things that I'm looking at this point for Florida's offensive line are whether or not it's going to be able to develop some consistency and some feel with guys like George and Crenshaw Dixon. It sounds like both of them have impressed their teammates and coaches with their communication, with their dedication to the work. But it's just a matter of, getting the necessary results to really feel that confidence in this unit. And I don't think Florida is there quite yet. So we'll have to see how things continue to develop. I have heard good things about the left side of Florida's offensive line. Austin Barber and Najee Harris have earned quite a bit of praise in my conversations with sources, and so has Jake Slaughter at center. So that side plus the center seem really shored up at this point. We know who those starters are going to be. I'm confident as of August 16th to say that I think we know who the other two starters will be in George and Crenshaw Dixon. But is that more up in the air than the left side and center? It is. And is there more concern about that group's performance, regardless of who's going to end up in the starting five on opening day? I think that also is fair to say at this point. So scrimmage on August 17th, I think will be very telling. One of my first questions in my conversations with people after that wraps up will be, how did the offensive line perform? How did Damian George perform? Did Cameron Waits participate? Did Rod Kearney participate? That's another guy who I think could provide some extra depth as an interior lineman. And the answers to those things I think will be very telling, especially because we're at that point in the preseason, where things should really start to be crystallizing. So Florida needs to start gaining a clearer picture of what's going to happen. I think that they're getting closer to that point, for good or for bad, and we'll learn more after tomorrow's scrimmage.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Kearney, because he's someone that I do kind of think flies under the radar a little bit. Many people think that he's exclusively working as just the backup center behind Jake Slaughter. That's not true. He also has the ability to play guard for Florida, and I do think that if Damian George, if his play is not up to par, you could see him also get a look there as one of these guys at guard for Florida there on the right side of the offensive line. That wouldn't surprise me, especially if something happens as the season goes on, along with Caden Jones and another younger guy, that Florida is, I think, very, very high on. Dealt with a little, minor injury as well there in fall camp. But I also think that Florida really is impressed with the younger offensive linemen. Just will they be able to step in and play a large role rather than being rotational pieces along the offensive line? I think that remains to be seen. But the injury to Waits, even though he returned today to participation, and we had seen him not in a non-contact jersey for the last couple of days, but just working out on his own with an assistant coach away from his unit. So clearly not something that is major, but missing practice time when you're vying for any form of role certainly can, I think, hinder you a little bit here. So we'll definitely hear more about this after the scrimmage. How the offensive line does, I think, will certainly play a large role in how effective the running backs are. That is something that stood out to me when Billy Napier discussed the scrimmage after last week back on Monday. He said that the running back unit, I think, certainly is one that we need to get a little bit more out of. And that makes sense, clearly, when you're missing Montrell Johnson Jr., and certainly that can change when you get him back there. But I do think it speaks to the overall lack of experience there at the running back position. And it's certainly something to follow, knowing that Billy Napier's offenses have historically been run dominant and rely on running backs being very good in pass pro, which is certainly something that Johnson does very, very well. And how well are the younger guys and, former JUCO transfer Jacoby Jackson, how good are they going to be in that role? I know that they've worked on it a ton in fall camp, but certainly they're going to have to prove that they can do it when they get into a game. So we'll have a lot more over at Swamp247 after the scrimmage. Look for some depth chart predictions, some insider notes, a ton of stuff coming as Florida prepares to open the season against the Miami Hurricanes. Nearly 2 weeks away. We'll have college football back next Saturday. I know Jacob is as excited as I am to actually see some games rather than just, individual drills and a lot of off-season content. So look for a lot of stuff over at Swamp247. And that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. For Graham Hall and Jacob Rudner, we'll see you next time.